Hello Year 3, Mrs Nicholson here. I'm going to read the next chapter of Kid Normal. Chapter 8, The Ultra Spoon. Ribbon Robotics headquarters was situated on the outskirts of the town at the edge of a large and mostly deserted industrial park. The company's founder had chosen it deliberately because it was so isolated. Arabella Ribbon had been developing a range of combat drones which she was hoping to sell to the army. Her grand idea was that her flying robots could be sent out onto the battlefield to fight instead of soldiers, communicating with each other like electronic insects. But of course, Arabella Ribbon wasn't in charge anymore, and in the 6 months since she had disappeared, company policy had changed. On the top floor of the Ribbon Robotics headquarters was a long, bright room which Arabella had used to hold meetings. But in the large leather chair she used to occupy at one end of the room, there now sat a repulsive-looking creature. Once he had been a young robotics engineer called Clive Meek, but he was using a different name these days. "All hail Nectar," proclaimed his servant, whose name was Gary, entering the room carrying a tray loaded with sweet fizzy drinks. In fact, Gary wasn't really a servant. He was a student who'd been sent to Ribbon Robotics on a work experience placement. He was supposed to be spending 3 months learning how a real working robotics factory operated. Instead, on his very first day, he'd been ushered into Nectar's presence, which had been quite a shock. But when a man who appears to be half wasp announces that you are now his personal servant, it's probably just as well to agree and do as you're told. Bright sunshine streamed through the windows that lined the length of the boardroom. Nectar's bulbous black eyes seemed to be greedily sucking the sides of the brightly coloured cans of drink, and he reached out long-fingered hand and selected one. He opened it and held it up at chest height. Gary tried to not look too repulsive as a long, flexible tongue flopped out of Nectar's mouth and began to slurp at the sticky, sweet liquid. It was truly gross. "All-powerful Nectar," began Gary, swallowing back a small globule of sick that had forced its way up to the back of his throat. "The applicants are waiting in the antechamber whenever you are ready to receive them." For Nectar, taking over the robotics factory had been just the start. He was simply buzzing with evil schemes, and now he decided to appoint a second-in-command to help implement them. And here is a picture of evil Nectar with his servant, Gary. Of course, most of the staff at the factory weren't aware that they were now working for the product of a hideously botched experiment that had fused the brainwaves and DNA of a man with those of a wasp. They'd probably have complained to Human Resources about it. No, they thought they still worked for the haughty and unavailable Arabella Ribbon, who had never been much of a mingler at the best of times, and now seemed to be more reclusive than ever. But a few carefully chosen members of staff knew the truth, and it was from these select few that he was going to pick his head henchperson. Apart from anything else, Nectar had thought making them go through a stressful interview would completely take up the middle of their day. And if there's one thing that wasps love, it's spoiling people's lunch. "Should I send them through to the boardroom?" asked Gary. "Not yet," snapped Nectar in his petulant, reedy, buzzy voice. "Go through to the antechamber, and I shall summon them when I am ready." By now, his long, hollow tongue was getting to the end of the first can of drink, and it made that horrible plug hole noise as it slurped up the last drops. Gary's cheeks bulged. He bowed and left the room. Nectar waited for a few seconds, then leaned forward to the intercom on the desk in front of him. He pressed the button. "Are you in the antechamber yet, Gary?" There was silence. Nectar snapped another can of fizzy drink open. He tried to wait patiently and lasted about 3 seconds. "Gary!" he shouted, jabbing the intercom button again. Yes, all-powerful Nectar," said the work experience kid. His voice was distorted by the speaker, but he still sounded like he had been sick in a pot plant. "Send the candidates through to the boardroom, would you?" buzzed Nectar. He leaned back in his chair like a great, sugar-crazed loon. This ought to be fun, he thought. After a moment, 3 people trooped through the double doors and stood at the other end of the room. Each placed an object covered with white cloth on the table in front of them. Two of the candidates, a woman and a man, were dressed in white lab coats. The third, a pale man with a pointed nose and carefully arranged hair, was wearing a smart suit and very shiny black shoes that ended in sharp points. They were the sort of shoes you should never trust. He brushed some dust off his chair before sitting down carefully, pulling at the front of his trousers as not to spoil their creases. The other two looked nervous, fiddling with their files they'd brought in with them, but he gazed coolly at Nectar and waited politely for him to begin speaking. "Welcome, my trusted servants," began Nectar. "As you know, I've decided to honour one of you with a very special opportunity." He broke off and sucked ravenously at his can of drink. "But this job can only go to one who is worthy. Who amongst you can impress me enough to become my head henchman? Hench person, he corrected himself quickly, seeing the female candidate bristling. Even a giant wasp needs to know where to draw the line. Who wants to go first? The white-coated man took the opportunity and stood up. He was a twitchy kind of person with food stains down his front, thick black-rimmed glasses and hair that looked like it had gone mad. Oh, and he had a strong German accent, which was strange, as he was actually from Reading. "We've just put it in to keep you on your toes. My name," he began in his strong German accent, remember, no slacking, "is Professor Graham Smith, and I would like to share with you my dastardly evil invention. Behold." At this, he whipped the cloth in front of him away, revealing a decidedly normal-looking spoon with a red button on the handle. "The Ultra Spoon," gloated Smith, looking round in triumph at the other two candidates. "Never again will we suffer the indignity of stirring our own tea." He tried to think of another word for behold, but couldn't, and instead shouted, "Because," for no reason. The room fell silent. Someone coughed. With a dramatic flourish, Smith pressed the button of the spoon, and there were tiny whizzing noises as the end of it began to spin around. Smith laughed delightedly, only stopping when Nectar got to his feet, leaped around to the table, and stung him unconscious. And there we go, it's a picture of the three candidates. It was only a little sting, mind you, but he suddenly took on the demeanour of a businessman who had fallen asleep on the last train home after one too many drinks at the Christmas party. He slumped sideways off his chair, dribbling. "Next!" Nectar yelled at the top of his voice. "Penny Percival, evil Lord Nectar," said the female candidate primly. "As you know, I have been in charge of your robotic insect programme. Using your research, we have developed a fleet of spy drones to do your bidding. To the human eye, they are almost indistinguishable from a normal wasp, but in fact, each contains a sophisticated camera, microphone and guidance system. They are the most advanced spy robots ever built." She glanced snugly at the motionless form of Graham Smith on the floor beside her, where he was collecting a sizable puddle of drool around his mouth. Nectar smiled. "But what I have to show you today is something else altogether," she continued. "I've become a little concerned that we haven't really been doing much to help the planet." The smile instantly vanished from Nectar's face. Unfazed by this, Penny removed the white cloth in front of her to reveal a bowl with a single rainbow-striped fish in the bottom of it. Beside it was a glass jar of foul-looking brownish sludge. "This robot fish is the answer to all the world's clean water problems," announced Penny. "Please observe." She tipped the stinking liquid into the fish bowl, and through the murk, Nectar's bulbous eyes could just make out the small fish beginning to swim backwards and forwards. The pointy-shoed man leaned forward with interest. Gradually, as the fish swam around, the liquid in the bowl began to clear, until a few minutes later the fish was swimming contentedly in a perfectly clean water, an adorable smile on its face. To anyone who wasn't an evil wasp-based hybrid, this would be the most remarkable thing in the whole world. But sadly, that's exactly what Nectar was, and he hated it. He jumped up, darted to the other end of the table, grabbed the fish out of his bowl, and stamped on it repeatedly, yelling, "What stamp is the point stamp of that? How am I supposed to be a supervillain stamp if all I do is clean people's ponds? Stamp, stamp, stamp." Penny Percival gathered up the remains of her miraculous fish and ran from the room in tears. Nectar returned to his seat, laced his hands behind his head, and turned his attention wordlessly to the smartly dressed man. "Knox, sir. Nicholas Knox," the man said. I joined the company 3 years ago to work on your personal robot strike force, and I've been keen to meet with you. Your reputation precedes you, sir. For a man who'd watched one of his colleagues stung until he passed out and the other have her invention stamped on repeatedly, Knox didn't seem nervous. He had indeed only started at Ribbon Robotics recently, and he had risen quickly up the ranks with a delicate combination of oilness and acidity. Like a sneaky salad dressing, he flicked a lock of his carefully arranged hair back from his face and calmly removed the white cloth from his own invention. It looked not unlike a yellow and black striped cycle helmet, though it was thinner and more delicate. But this was no ordinary cycle helmet, as Knox was about to reveal. This is no ordinary cycle helmet, he confirmed. I wonder if we might have a volunteer, sir. Nectar pressed his intercom. Gary, would you step in here a moment? There was silence. Impatiently, Nectar strode to the door and flung it open. Gary! He bellowed at the top of his voice. Yes, my lord, replied Gary, who was squatting on a small stool in the corridor in case he was needed. Go to the intercom room in the antechamber, commanded Nectar. But I'm already here, your waspiness, began Gary desperately, before seeing the expression on Nectar's face and scuttling away. Nectar returned to his chair. He waited a moment, then pressed the button in front of him again. Gary, would you step in here a moment? Yes, Lord Nectar, replied Gary, secretly rolling his eyes. A moment later, he trespassed back into the boardroom. How can I be of service, sir? Try this on for size, Knox instructed. Gary did as he was told and carefully placed the black and yellow hat on his head. It fits, he exclaimed. Of course he fits, replied a smug-looking Knox. It's a one-size-fits-all mind control helmet. A what control helmet? Squeaked Gary. Nothing, Knox said guiltily. Now, Mr. Gary, he went on, your challenge is a simple one. I'd like you to run at the wall as fast as you possibly can. What? I'm not going to do that, I'll hurt, said Gary. Knox reached up, pushed a button on the back of the helmet. Lights flickered into life along both sides of it, and immediately Gary's eyes widened and, more worryingly, changed colour. The white had become a bright yellow, with huge black pupils in the centre. Now, let's try again, shall we, said Knox forcefully. Drone, I want you to run at the wall as fast as you can. Immediately, Gary ran at full pace straight into the wall. His face hit it with a crack and he fell onto the floor, unconscious. Nectar roared with delighted laughter. He's been knocked out, cold. Ah, good one, sir, lied Knox. So, as you can see, I've managed to find a way of controlling the human brain. I can make anyone do anything. You mean we can make anyone do anything? Said Nectar. Yes, that's what I said, sir, said Knox with a twitch at the corner of his mouth. I can make anyone do anything. So do I get the job? Oh, yes, said Nectar greedily as he reached out for the helmet that Knox had removed from the motionless Gary. Welcome to the hive, Knox. That's bees, you idiot, snide Knox, but not loudly enough for Nectar to hear. That's the end of that chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye for now.